All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here with Morsi of DevNull Productions and Anthony Lusardi, and we're going to be talking about a very hot topic in the crypto community. I'm really excited about this, by the way. We're going to break down the technical components about the XRP ledger, and we're going to discuss where on the centralization spectrum do they fall. So what we're going to do is kind of start by some brief introductions. Anthony, why don't you introduce yourself? I think Mo's the most recent person that's had an introduction. So Anthony, please introduce yourself, and you know let's go from there.
Yeah, sure. My name's Anthony. I've been active in cryptocurrency since about 2015 or so. Originally, I was interested in Ethereum at the start. Um, I ended up going the other way of the Ethereum fork and supporting ETC for a long time, and worked at the ETC cooperative up until recently. And now I'm, freelancing and doing my own thing. Planning to launch some things soon. But in general, I have a background kind of in a couple different things. I'm a self-taught programmer, and then I also previously did a lot of market research and that type of thing. So, um, yeah, in my day-to-day, I switch between a project manager or a developer, but I can only be one of those in any given day. And yeah, that's who I am.
Okay, and Mo, why don't we jump over to you for a sec while I finish up this the tweet here, just to let everyone know we're live with the link.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks for having me, Joe. Great to be back on BLOCKTV. So for those who don't know, my name is Mo Morsi. I am founder and CEO of DevNull Productions. We are a company that focuses on blockchain analytics and blockchain intelligence, currently specializing in XRP. Personally speaking, I have been in the blockchain world almost since the very beginning. Maybe 2011 was a year that I first attended my first Bitcoin meetup. Immediately was a fan of the notion of the decentralized ledger, trustless networks, and so on and so forth, and have been staying up to date with and playing around with the different generations of technology ever since. My background, I'm a software engineer by trade. I worked for 12 years at Red Hat as a software engineer, working on many different projects from the operating system to the cloud and everything in between. So, today I'm here supporting XRP. I'm a really big fan of the technology, kind of looking at the different generations of blockchain as they evolved. I am very firmly confident that XRP is the solution and will be the de facto standard going on into the future, as we will talk about today.
Yeah, so the ultimate goal here is to, again, focus on technical components. We've had, obviously one of the ongoing disputes with XRP between, maxis, Bitcoin maximalists, and even people outside the XRP community. We already know the distribution of wealth argument, so we're going to save that one toward the end. Is there anything that you guys felt like we should start with, or are we just going to go at the top of the list and just kind of break it down from there?
Yeah, sure. Your choice.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, let's ask the most general question. All right. Is Ripple centralized? The XRP ledger, is it centralized? Yes or no? And why in a couple minutes. Let's start with you, Mo.
Yeah, I mean, excuse me. As we talked about in our first discussion, Joe, it's important to make the distinction between Ripple Labs and XRP, right? Ripple Labs is a private entity. They operate like any private institution, are subject to US laws and so on and so forth. XRP is the digital asset, which is kind of the basis of the XRP ledger, the blockchain, which is used to facilitate cross-border transactions and so on and so forth. So it's quite obvious that Ripple Labs is a singular entity like any other corporation in the United States or in the world. But XRP itself is a decentralized network, the XRP ledger, excuse me. Now, I say this because quite provably, Ripple Labs does not operate the majority of the nodes. They actually operate a very small subset, less than 10%.
How many nodes are there?
On the entire network, there are thousands of nodes.
Of voting nodes.
We're talking about validators now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you have a couple hundred. At the maximum, at any given point, they can fluctuate. More or fewer appear on the network at any given time. That's and obviously this is increasing over time as more institutions and organizations adopt the ledger. So to go back to the original question, yes, it is a decentralized network. You have many different organizations, individuals, institutions contributing to the consensus process, the process in which that transactions are validated. The whole network can trust that only those who are authorized to access and send funds are able to do so, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so we'll start. So you're basically saying no, the XRP ledger is not centralized. It is different from Ripple Labs, the company. XRPL is self-sustaining, self-sufficient. Ripple Labs owns few of the nodes relative to the total amount. Now, all right. So did that kind of capture everything in a nutshell?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm not being overly general intentionally. If I do happen to be a little too general, please correct me. Feel free to jump in and correct me. This is not 2-on-1. I just want to make that point very clear.
Just here for discussion, right, Joe?
What's that?
We're just having a friendly discussion.
Yeah. I just don't want. I really am neutral because the technical space isn't my expertise. That's why we have you guys. So again, if I generalize things too much, my job is to hopefully bring things to common ground for the outsider. And if I'm over general and you have a way to generalize it with a little more sense, please feel free to jump in. My goal is not to take away from anything that you're saying. Now, on to Anthony. Can you please answer that same question in about the same amount of time?
Yeah, sure. So I think, first when you Mo brought up a good contrast between Ripple, the company, which is obviously one centralized entity, and XRP, the ledger, or Ripple Daemon, which is something else. And in that, when we're, at least in the blockchain sense, when we're talking about centralization or decentralization, we're more talking about a relative sense. So relative to, say, Bitcoin, I would say that the XRP ledger is actually highly centralized by design, no matter the amount of validators you add on the list. And the main reason for that is because the real thing that enabled cryptocurrencies to begin with, the real thing that gave you this source of truth that required no interference or involvement of other parties, such as a set of validators, is proof of work, because you end up with you have a very simple fork choice in proof of work when everybody's following the same set of rules. So regardless of other forks that want to change the rules of the network, if Bitcoin is following its set of rules for the network and it sees two chains, it knows to follow the longer one. Whereas with Ripple, what happens with nodes that end up seeing two different chains is it either hopes that 80% of the validator list say that which of these two chains it's seen that are correct, in which case these validators are actually telling you and they don't have any other proof behind it other than this is the reality they've seen. Or if that doesn't happen, then the network essentially halts and then requires human intervention in order to decide which chain is correct. And it's that human intervention in that edge case where the chain halts that actually creates the centralization. The only thing that XRP Ledger hasn't done yet is actually hit that. But when it does, then you need to go through the centralized process of resolving not the rules of the network or not anything that you would have to coordinate socially. No, not patching bugs, nothing like that. Simply deciding which of two different chains that you're seeing is the real one. And that's where you get the centralization. Unfortunately, though, we haven't actually demonstrated that yet because of rather tight control over the validator list.
Understood.
Yeah, I agree with that, So you started off by saying proof of work is the kind of notion which makes a decentralized network decentralized. I completely disagree with that.
No, not the network itself. It's what makes the decision-making for the state of the network
Yes, but you're saying proof of work is kind of the critical aspect of that, and that is blatantly false. You know, it is quite obvious by this point in time that the last 5 years or plus that Ripple, that XRP ledger has been running, that, you know, you don't need proof of work. Proof of work is a very inefficient system which to solve this problem. You know, it was great in 2009 to 2016, 2017. I have no objections against it back then, but obviously didn't scale as the network underwent higher strain and higher demand.
One question,
You have the Byzantine consensus model.
No, hold on. I think we got a clutter here. All right, so Mo, can you finish your thought and then let Anthony jump in?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So with the Byzantine consensus model, yes, you do need 80% of the validators on the network to be in agreement of the order of the transactions to receive a consent to arrive upon consensus. Now, if that doesn't happen, the network does stop. You know, I think, you know, some people may have objections to this, but if there's an intruder into your network, into a traditional computer network, you want to halt all access immediately until you figure out what the situation is. You don't want people using that network, you know, under the assumption that everything is going right, and then later on, hey, we found that there's a double spend. That is an unacceptable situation for me. And the fact that, you know, many of these proof of work networks have undergone this just shows a fundamental flaw in the model. Now, you know, as to the kind of the genesis of a network as it's building up and it's kind of, while it's smaller, yes, I agree, it's in a more vulnerable state. Yes, you need trusted individuals and organizations to kind of manage the affairs. You know, if you don't have that, you're going to have chaos. It's just everyone's going to be doing whatever they want, and it's just going to go to, you know, hell. You have this in the case of the Bitcoin core community, the core development group. They are the central authority that kind of dictates what goes into the code base, what everyone who's running Bitcoin miners and validators, you know, the rules that they follow. Same with the Ethereum Foundation. You know, the idea is that over time, though, with Ripple and with XRP, as the network grows, the reliance on Ripple Labs will decrease to the point which, you know, Ripple Labs will be able to go away and the network will still operate.
Well, okay. Yeah, so I'll address that first point, that last point first. I would say as far as any of these networks go, when they're sticking to the current rule set, these organizations could all disappear at any given time. I don't think that Bitcoin is any more centralized there. I know they keep very tight control over at least the Bitcoin D, the main repo on GitHub has, you know, follows very good software, good practices, you know, lots of levels to approve any change that goes into it. But most importantly, the Bitcoin network itself, as it runs, except for the fact that 2 major bugs needed to be patched at some point because they were, you know, a couple of buffer overflows had to be patched. Other than that, the Bitcoin network itself hasn't had any actual breaking changes since about 0.2, and then 0.7 to 0.8, where there was that other bug that had to be fixed. But that was those were more just technical things.
I mean, that's ignoring all the forks, right? Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin.
Forks have nothing to do with centralization, other than them being centralized themselves. I wouldn't say that forks are an important thing to consider in this particular debate. Am I wrong in saying that, or are we cool with just like putting forks aside? I don't care about Roger Coin. I don't care about Craig Coin. I don't care about all these fake forks of Bitcoin. All we care about is right now is XRP centralized, and what are the technical arguments on both sides of that?
Yeah, I mean, who's to designate what's a fake fork and what not? I mean, as soon as you have some,
well, the consensus of the users, ultimately, the miners are going to mine the most profitable chain. The users are going to choose which chain that is, because if no one's using a cryptocurrency, then the economic model for it is such that the supply is X and the demand is much lower than X. And so the price is going to shoot down. Therefore, miners are incentivized to mine the chain with the most expensive coins. And so, yeah, what to say?
I'd say for the sake of just this discussion that we imagine that XRP as it exists, the current rules of the network, and Bitcoin as it exists, the current rules of the network, are the only two cryptocurrencies in existence. Just because otherwise, yeah, anybody could fork any code base at any time and change the rules to whatever they want. And that's fine, but I don't think that that's a relevant consideration for whether or not the network that's following the rules that are programmed is centralized or
yeah, not. I'm going to disagree here, but for the purpose of the discussion, we can definitely move on.
Yeah, let's hit this back. If we really want to hit this, let's hit this in part 2, because I think I have a feeling this is going to be a part 1, part 2. There's so much to discuss here. So let's just get the ball rolling. We have the fundamental question has been asked: where are we on a centralized spectrum? Anthony says centralized. Mo says not centralized. XRP ledger is what we're referring to here. So let's jump into the technical components that support either argument.
Yeah.
Now,
I'm going to get back to Mo's other points first and just respond to them. As far as proof of work not scaling, proof of work is part of the consensus decision of the network. It's not it in and of itself. It's only for deciding fork choice. It's only for miners to use to order transactions and create blocks. As far as scaling goes, it doesn't really have anything to do with scaling.
That's false. I mean, the creation of blocks is the core aspect of a blockchain. I mean, how can you say that if you require a massive amount of energy to create a new block, and
hashes are
not have that energy? It's proven centralized in the sense that now what percentage of miners are operating in China and are subjected to
that's it's a bit different.
Hash 2 megabytes, 4 megabytes, and probably up to 512 or a gigabyte before you even come up against some sort of CPU limit for generating that hash. That keeping blocks small or keeping blockchain bloat under control is another aspect of trying to keep a maximally decentralized network when you want every single node operator to be able to fully validate the entire state from inception to current so that they can confirm for themselves, independent of any other party, that this is the actual state of the network. But that's not proof of work. That's just another design consideration to cryptocurrencies. You could do, and I really wish we were excluding other blockchains, right? But there is another blockchain that decided that they were going to go absolutely insane with block size. And what they could actually do is they could just hold blocks and only give you the blocks you ask for or the transactions you ask for. And then you could do certain like client things and prove the Merkle proof and go up the tree and say, oh yeah, this is part of that block. And the proof of work was done, so this is good. But what would have happened there is the blockchain itself would have scaled, but you would have relied on going to these certain people for data rather than anybody being able to easily broadcast it.
All right, so hold on. With that being said, Anthony and Mo, we are going to keep this to the fundamentals here of the whole purpose of this conversation. So let's bring it right back and let's start jumping into some of these topics. All right, so let's talk about validator lists. Let's start with you, Anthony. Where are we at? What do validator lists mean? What are they? And what do they mean? What do you mean by validator lists contributing to the centralized component of XRP ledger?
So one of the things, and the actual answer to this question as far as Ripple's UNL validator lists go is we can't know how much of the network actually follows that list or uses their own sets of validators. Because we can't actually ask any nodes who they're following, which is unfortunate. I really wish that particular RPC query was open to the public, because it really is just a list of, I think it's validator addresses or the public keys. So I don't see it as very privileged information, but essentially, in a lot of software, what you get is people tend to run the defaults. So Ripple D, if you go and download it today, it's going to go to vl.ripple.com and say, what's the validator list? And as Mo mentioned, there's maybe 100 or so validators out there, and less than 10% are controlled by Ripple, and that's referring to that validator list. But the problem with that validator list is if an adversary gets control of it, they can actually use that validator list to double spend, because you could go take your own coins as a validator, send them, to an exchange, exchange credits as deposit. You do your double spend stuff, take off Bitcoin or whatever, and you could tell the rest of the network exactly what they want to hear, and you have that entire validator list, which Ripple D queries for about every minute or so. So you can completely take over the validator list. And I would hazard a guess that that UNL is trusted by the overwhelming majority of participants on the network. But it's not something we can prove or disprove, unfortunately, at least today.
Okay. Is that a good time for Mo to jump in?
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. So, Mo, what are your thoughts? Is there anything you'd like to rebuttal, or anything you want to say from a different learning perspective about validators or validator lists?
Yeah, there's a lot that I want to rebuttal, and I didn't really you didn't give me a chance to comment on, the comments earlier. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to start with that.
Well, keep in mind, this is a Ripple conversation. If we want to do a different, let's do a different one.
This was framed as an XRP versus Bitcoin debate, and you also
this isn't XRP versus Bitcoin. This is XRP centralized, yes or no. And if we're doing a Bitcoin thing, I'll bring in a Bitcoin specialist. We'll do a separate thing.
I respectfully ask that we, continue into what was sold. Now, proof of work. You threw out block sizes. You threw out this. You threw out that. You threw out a lot of kind of ifs situations. Let's look at the history. The proof is in the pudding. The point being is that XRP has never been compromised. These situations, these theoretical situations, now 5-10 years that the network has been operating, the network has never undergone this situation. There is financial incentive to do so. Obviously, XRP is not worth nothing. It's worth 30, 40 cents right now. So if you can compromise it, double spend or whatnot, there's a very big financial profit to be made. Now, proof of work is fundamentally flawed and not scalable. I'm sorry. You look at the
again, we could talk about proof of work and all this stuff. It's got to be a different talk. We got to stay on topic.
In 2017, I was waiting days for my Bitcoin and my Ethereum, my Bitcoin transactions to go through. This is ridiculous. No one is going to wait that long in the modern age. And to say, block sizes should be large to exclude people and whatnot, that is completely anti, decentralization, anti, empowering the people to take control of their own financial future. So, proof of work is simply detracting resources from other institutions which can legitimately use those computational resources. For example, scientific and other research institutions that need those systems. Well, now the cost of those systems to run on a proof of work model has skyrocketed, and thus they cannot perform their computations. So I have a very big ethical objection to proof of work.
Understood. So let's get back to Ripple now. Yeah. The validator lists. What are we hearing from you?
So let me say this. Let me ask you this: when a Bitcoin node comes onto the network, a miner, how do they know who to communicate with?
So one of the first things they'll do is they'll ask a series of boot nodes.
Where are the nodes?
So the boot nodes, like any network, even BitTorrent does this. They go and they talk to the first set of network participants that are pre-programmed into the application, which I'm sure you agree with. But let me just finish real quick.
I don't see how that's different.
Okay, so the thing is though, if you completely eclipse that boot node network and you get everybody on the same page, you get 100% of the boot nodes. And you launch Bitcoin as it is, you don't pass in any of your own flags, then yes, it is possible to eclipse that network and essentially lie about the state of the network to everybody who's downloaded that version. But I mean, your other options are you can add your own boot nodes with some flags, obviously, as you can do in Ripple. But the thing is that proof of work consensus just doesn't halt like BFT does.
It doesn't. What you have is a situation in which a malicious activity happens, and everyone it doesn't happen.
All right.
After the fact, legitimate transactions have gone through the network, that you discover, oh, hey, there's a problem, and now we have to figure it out. Do those legitimate transactions, do we roll them back? I mean,
it's more to lie, though.
I know we're getting so far off topic here. Let's get it.
It's still on topic.
I don't think so.
I would say, okay, on Ripple D and Bitcoin, I agree. If everybody's trusting the nodes pre-programmed into the software, then they have the potential to actually be lied to about what the true network is.
They're not. The software is used to seed the network, and then we can communicate.
And if somebody controls all of the nodes,
the manner they see fit.
If somebody controls all of the boot nodes for either of these networks, you can obviously be lied to. Anybody can. But in proof of work, for somebody to lie to you, they have to mine the blocks still, and you can verify that, and it's going to cost a good deal of money to keep up that lie. Whereas in Ripple or networks that don't rely on proof of work, specifically, that lie is essentially free or very cheap. You just have to make fake blocks.
But the point is, as soon as there is malicious activity, the network halts, and everyone on the network immediately knows that there's something amiss. No additional damage is done. Actually, no damage is done. In the point of the 51% attack, it's like, okay, someone spends the coins and then has their own private version of the blockchain. Everyone is using the network assuming that it's legitimate, even if you require a day's worth of validations, a week's worth of consensus of blocks, everyone is using it in that time. And then as soon as the double spend happens, we have a conundrum. I mean, what if people purchase and receive the goods? I mean, do we restore the Bitcoin? Do they have to return the goods? I mean, there's just so much uncertainty versus a kind of a deterministic model, which the XRP ledger represents, in which, hey, if this 80% consensus does not occur, let's stop and let's figure out what the situation is. Hey, I want it to stop, but this is known. This happens all the time in many different institutions where, hey, a critical error has occurred. We need to figure out how to resolve this error before we can resume our services.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent approach to quite a lot of software. I don't disagree with that. But what I would say is that double spends can happen on both networks. In Ripple, you would because look, the double spend would happen to your target, and then maybe eventually the word gets out and these ledgers are conflicting. All of a sudden, Binance is like, I saw a completely different ledger. What the hell happened here? Sends it out, and everybody else's node sees it. And then the network halts, and you have to make the decisions. But saying that
Binance does that, you still have 80% of the network that
still gets the double spend, though. I mean, somebody's going to be out money. Either Binance is going to be out money, or somebody else is, because Binance had a double spend, didn't know it at the time, credited it. Bitcoin or whatever was withdrawn in exchange, and then the network can halt after. I mean, all of these networks are deterministic in the way that if you give them the same inputs, they give you the same outputs, but they're not synchronous networks. They are all asynchronous networks.
Bitcoin is not deterministic. Bitcoin is probabilistic in the sense that
Bitcoin proof of work is probabilistic.
And proof of work is part of the network. If one aspect of the network is probabilistic, the whole network is probabilistic, because we don't know how much time it's going to take to.
The network rules are deterministic, but in both cases,
I gotta jump in and just make sure. I know I'm interrupting. We got to make sure that only one person talks at a time, because especially during online discussions, it just becomes a big jumble. The camera's flipping back and forth. We can't see what's going on, and no one's getting anything out of this. So at the very least, let's take a kind of deep breath here. And as we're hitting these debatable topics, let's do the courtesy of kind of giving someone 30, 45 seconds and then interrupting, and kind of fading in and out. But please continue. I feel like we're talking more about Bitcoin than we're talking about XRP. If that's what you guys feel is most needed to explain the situation, please do. But keep in mind, we have a half hour left, and we barely scratched the surface. We're on topic 1.
Sounds like it might be 3 debates, Joe.
We might be having more than one discussion for sure. But you guys are definitely smart. I'm happy to have you both. This is definitely educational. Now let's just make sure that the audience can hear more than jumbled lingo and split screens, bouncing back and forth. So we're still on validator list. We're still on. Anthony started with the UNL. How the number of centralizing components associated with it, and Mo is defending. So let's jump right back to Mo real quick. Validators.
Okay, I mean, you just want me to talk about validators? I mean,
well, we heard from Anthony his thoughts on what makes validation different with the UNLs in XRP ledger, and how that can lead to the default UNL being potentially compromised, being potentially leading toward a double spend, and how that can affect the network. So we want to just make sure that you defend XRP and say whatever you need to say on this topic to
yeah. I mean, the whole premise of this was, if someone gets control of the UNL, I mean, first of all, that whole situation is very, implausible. It's not going to happen. Ripple Labs employs very smart people, and as soon as that happened, if theoretically, I mean, it would be obviously known, and very quickly, people would be able to discount that trusted UNL. Now, anyone can publish a UNL. I advise against that at this current time because it would lead to more kind of fragmentation, and it would lead towards kind of more chaos than it's worth. But people have, and the network is operating just very fine. Actually, one person, a good friend of mine, Matt Hamilton on Twitter, he's published his own UNL. He runs his own validator set that doesn't have any of Ripple Labs' validator in there, just kind of a proof of concept. The UNL is just a suggestion, right? It's what you said before, a way to bootstrap access to the network and allow people to get on. So then from there, they can query which other peers exist and disconnect and connect as they see fit. So I don't see any kind of aspect of the UNL being a centralization component. It's just merely a way to get on board. And once you're in, you do what you will. The fundamental aspect of whether it's decentralized or not decentralized comes down to the consensus model. Once you have the network of nodes and operators, at what point do individual participants who want to do harm to that network are able to, and can they, and what percentage, and so on and so forth. And if they are able to make some fraudulent transactions or whatnot, how is that propagated? How is that relayed through the network and whatnot? With XRP, you have a situation in which any malicious activity or whatnot will be immediately detected, and those nodes on the network will be discounted. They're going to be ignored from that point on, so the network will continue as normally operating. If for whatever reason, the network can't establish consensus, it is halted, and then individuals, each individual organization, not one central authority dictating how things go, need to come together in kind of a human consensus process, a low-speed consensus process, and figuring out how to resolve the situation. Now, with Bitcoin and other proof of work currencies, digital currencies, you have, due to the high boilerplate, the massive amount of energy that that's required to run a miner and access this network. You have economies of scale come into play, right? You have the only institutions, the only entities that are able to influence and to manage this massive amount of power that's needed are entities like the Chinese government and other entities, perhaps criminal organizations and whatnot. It's like over the time, the legitimate players who these technologies were designed to are kind of priced out of the system, and you just have left the fraudulent players that are going to affect things. This is the trend that's been going in the last few years. You just can't deny it.
Okay, so any closing thoughts on validators?
I pretty much said what everything
Anthony, any closing thoughts?
As far as validators, I think it's an interesting point that Mo made there. where he said he recommends against other people running their own UNLs right now because it could lead to network fragmentation. And to me, that seems like it could lead. That kind of is, you know, if the network is capable of fragmenting under its own rules, that's kind of points you towards there are these centralization aspects. So if these UNLs started disagreeing, these two different lists, the validators on each of them started disagreeing, you might end up with two different XRP networks, and then need to determine which is the true XRPL. And that's maybe even without necessarily, or with sort of halting. But yeah, you'll get the partitioning, and a network that partitions is kind of centralized in my view.
Okay.
Yeah.
But, so that being, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, as far as, because that kind of leads into the next thing, which is what happens when the network halts. I agree with Mo, when the network halts, you're going to get a group of people together, and they're going to collectively decide, you know, each having whatever weight they do on which network is the true network. And in that case, at least in practical terms, you're going to end up in a situation, and I have personal experience of this because I supported ETC, Ethereum Classic, for so long. When you have just a few entities who control a substantial amount of the supply of a currency, they actually have the ability to completely devalue any forks that they disagree with, or any no forks that they disagree with, any other chains they disagree with, even if they're following the rules. And so I think in that case, I think what you would find if this situation did happen is Ripple would say, we have 55 billion XRP, and we can market dump a billion of it every month as it unlocks, you know, it on any forks that we don't like, which is well within their right. And it's obviously not, it's not a major, it's a major part of the network, but it just, it's very interesting because you can imagine a situation where the US suddenly forks and there's, you know, imagine if a foreign country had a substantial amount of your money supply, the amount of damage they could do. They can do the same the other way. We actually saw that in ETC where I think within 1 week there was about 3 million ETC, or about 5 to 10% of the total out circulating supply at the time, all sold at one time in order to do that type of thing and behavior. So yeah, there's concerns there too, because that's the thing, you want to remove the human element. And I think proof of work doesn't solve a technical problem. There's much better technical solutions to this type of thing. Proof of work is a technical solution to a very human problem, in that we're all very much self-interested. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here. So a couple points, right? It's like if the network, hypothetically, this has obviously never happened with XRP, but where it's a fork, you know, what would prevent the people from forking from saying, okay, we know Ripple Labs owns these wallets, these escrow accounts and whatnot. We're just going to discount them. You know, they're no longer participates in our network. You know, it's a hypothetical, yes, but I mean, this whole, it seems like all the situations you're presenting to try and, you know, make XRP seem illegitimate are hypotheticals.
Well,
whereas Ethereum and Ethereum Classic and you know, these other forks which have occurred are, you know, it's in history now. I mean, it's quite obvious that these things are vulnerable to it. You know, forking in general. So we have to look at where the term forking comes from, right? It comes from the open source world. You know, I'm, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a software engineer at Red Hat and have many years of experience. I was a software engineer, excuse me, before launching my startup. Many years of experience working on many open source projects. And forking in general is extremely, you know, it's disencouraged at any level, you know, at the code base on these networks and whatnot, because you have fragmentation, right? You have two groups of people who are not able to come to see eye to eye, and they kind of say, I'm going to take it and go with it, my way or the highway. So, the notion that, an individual or an organization owning a large percentage of the digital asset kind of impacts this, I reject that notion, because, once the fork is created, they're on their own. They do whatever they want. And I don't think.
Hold on. But when you say they do whatever they want, they can make that 55 billion in escrow. Let's just use XRP for the example. Say there's a fork and Ripple Labs has 55 billion of now XRP and the XRP fork. You're saying the forked coin can get rid of those 55 billion tokens?
If they want it. I mean, that's their fork. They own the rules, right? It doesn't make much sense for me for Ripple Labs to play in that manner. It's like saying, oh, we're gonna dump all the coins on the fork or whatever, because they're almost legitimizing the fork in that sense. They're saying, hey, we acknowledge it's a thing or whatnot. If I was an entity, I would say, hey, listen, we try to work with them. We still want to work with them. We don't want to do anything antagonizing. This is a shame. Let's try to be adults and come to a consensus, if you will. So this whole notion that ownership of the currency impacts the the fork and the behavior and whatnot, it's false as far as I'm concerned. And another point is, who knows? I mean, in the future, what happens if an organization owns a significant amount of Bitcoin? Will you all of a sudden say, hey, the same thing you were criticizing XRP for, now we're going to criticize Bitcoin for it because the Chinese government owns 2/3 or a third or whatever of the supply? I mean, it seems like it's the same argument.
So I would disagree with any fork that's going to take any value that somebody legitimately owns away from the owner of it. So to me, taking away that 55 million XRP because it's existential threat to your network is obviously wrong. So the issue there though is I'm talking about fair forks where everybody actually still, for XRP it's a little different, but so everybody actually still follows the rules of the network. Those types of things where maybe somebody did get double spent and the network halted after it was discovered. And then you have these two different sides where one's like, no, this is my money, and no, this is my money.
We're talking about XRP here?
Yeah, we're talking about XRP.
But my point is that wouldn't happen on XRP because it would have to be
happen because packets take time to propagate across the network. Networks are still fragmented. Even in a broadcast network, it can take minutes to get data across it. And it's entirely possible if everybody's listening to the same validator list, which is kind of the biggest situation where this would happen, or most plausible situation where this would happen, you can eclipse the network because your validators can tell one party one thing and another party the other thing, and they'll believe it. And then at some future point in time, they actually might realize that there's a conflict between these ledgers and want to resolve it. But you'll have some people saying, no, I received this money. And then you'll have other people saying, no, I received this money, and they both can't coexist. But that's just the way. So in that case, like that's like the centralization. That's like the core centralized thing in that you have a network where it halts under some conditions, and the conditions where it halts means that some group of people need to decide which is the true history of the network. And in that case, you may end up in a situation where people get disenfranchised. You had mentioned earlier, actually, that, because the way that proof of work solves this is they make those types of things expensive, such that it become prohibitively expensive. You had mentioned earlier, like, even if you wait a week for Bitcoin confirmations to pile up on top of your transaction, you could still be double spent on. Yes, in theory you can, without a doubt. But in actual economic terms, if I sent you money today on Bitcoin and you waited a week before you did anything with it, or before you trusted me to maybe send me a laptop or something in exchange, it would cost me a good $250 million worth of hash rate in order to actually double spend you for that laptop.
Yeah, and to be fair, that's nothing to the Chinese government, right?
That's prohibitively expensive, though, for that type of attack. So proof of work lets you choose the level of security you need. If you're receiving $1 million on Bitcoin, you do not trust one or two confirmations. You wait a day. If you're receiving $1 billion,
if the Chinese government decides that Bitcoin is a threat to their financial system, they will spend far more than $250 million to take it down.
Well, let's say, again, it already is a threat to most financial systems, and
no, it's not, because they're not threatened by it. I mean, if they were threatened by it, they would shut it down overnight. I mean,
well, there's always regulatory FUD surrounding the space. Obviously, it's going to keep getting stronger and stronger. So we'll have to see. This one's a little bit more of a speculative in time discussion, but $250 million, yeah, it's probably not much to a massive government. I'll agree with that. But again, this is a very different situation. I guess I'm going to leave it back to you guys to talk about that.
So if I could just close that out, if the Chinese government decided that they hated Bitcoin and they wanted to create forks, you could see this happen once they actually broadcast the blocks. But effectively, with proof of work, the best you can achieve to quote unquote take down the network is spend $250 million a week just to do a denial of service attack, which would probably set world records in the most expensive denial of service attack ever, and would actually be really interesting to see. Chinese government, if you're watching this, please denial of service attack Bitcoin at $250 million a week.
Well, if they're watching it, I invest in them. Anyways, I guess we can move on, and I'm disagreeing with a lot, but again, it comes down to economies of scale, and the notion that over time these systems, the proof of work systems, have been proven to be more vulnerable to situations with centralization of control, and with more of an uncertainty as to how we're going to resolve this, and so many forks and whatnot. You said you didn't want to talk about forks, and then you brought up a couple, but I want to
talk about software forks.
As people are trying to solve this, whereas there have been 0 forks of XRP, and how many years on, no one has been able to take down the network, even though XRP and the XRP ledger is being used now by many countries, India, Brazil, so on and so forth, for their cross-border remittances. You have all sorts of micropayment services with Coil and streaming payment services popping up now, being kind of adopted in mass to fulfill those roles that have not been possible before. So the proof will be in the pudding. I encourage everyone who's watching to kind of go back and look at the history of these things, and try not to get confused with all the technical jargon and all this stuff. Kind of try to conceptualize this is kind of as a simple network of nodes, and the different things, that the different trade-offs that the proof of work model versus the Byzantine model entails, and make your own decision.
Agreed.
Yeah. So regarding centralization of control of proof of work, that's actually not true. The best data that I've seen comes from Coinmetrics, where you obviously can only do it by mining pool. But even that, mining pools, they come and they go, and it actually seems that hash rate is distributing between them as time goes on. Also, as time goes on, we're starting to run up against actual transistor size limits, which is great, because it eventually means that hardware can't grow any bigger or more powerful. So eventually it'll reach a maximum and potentially come down in total cost, as manufacturers are basically optimizing around that transistor maximum that they can do. There's a lot of things. Really, though, proof of work in that way, proof of work doesn't really control any of the networks, the rules, or anything of the sort. We've actually seen that historically, where large miners have tried to control the rules. In both Ripple and Bitcoin's case, those types of rules are just BFT rules, and they're agreed to by the participants of the network, so miners only order transactions. And then the other thing is, used in mass. I mean, I don't want to argue over really which ones use more or less. From on-chain data, you can actually see the usage for each of them for payments. But very interestingly, just not, what's the word? It's not based in fact, it's just my own experience. I'm forgetting the word right now, but I've seen quite a few places where Bitcoin is accepted here, but I haven't actually seen any places where Ripple is accepted here. So, I mean, adoption is fine, and I know that there's the narrative around banks adopting it and that type of thing, but from the majority of people I've talked to, at least within my own social circle, and again, only from my experiences, anybody who works in the financial sectors of either cryptocurrency or banking in general, for cryptocurrency, they'll say they only want Bitcoin as in BTC, the asset. And when it comes to the financial in general, they say Ripple does have a lot of good software, but they don't use XRPL because they're not using XRP.
Or whatnot. You know, I disagree. You know, people, for most people that I have spoken to that are hodlers of Bitcoin, they're just holding. They're not spending. Yes, anyone can put a Bitcoin is accepted here logo on their business, but then ask them what percentage of revenue of transactions they come in through Bitcoin, and it'll be dismal. Let's talk in a year, right? It's
yeah. I mean, personally, I'll tell you, I'm getting paid in Bitcoin. I pay for certain things online in Bitcoin. So I definitely look for the opportunity to use Bitcoin, but that is a valid point. Let's hit this in a year. I do repetitively hear XRP is growing. It's centralized now. XYZ. There are certain things that need to grow, and I'm willing to say, all right, let's let this hit real world, hit the real world fan. But as of right now, that is a valid point. But on to the next thing. All right, we have about 10 minutes here, maybe +5. Is there something you guys want to hit that you think we can clean out in 15 minutes, or should we just jump on one of these and then hit the buzzer when it needs to end and then pick it up next time?
So I have something related to Ripple, but it's not related to any of this. It's my own personal bullish case for Ripple.
Okay.
Which is Ripple technology is actually used by a lot of banks, but Ripple XRP, the ledger, isn't, and they seem to be hesitant to adopt it. They'll use Xcurrent and that type of thing. My own bullish case for Ripple, and I don't know what banking regulations are like, and I would actually hope that there's a banking regulation that doesn't allow for people to just kind of transmit money over various currencies that they're not aware of. But my own personal bullish case for Ripple is Ripple, the company, makes XRapid the default in their software, and nobody bothers to check or care, and they run the defaults, which is a pretty common thing in software in general. But
not when you're a bank. You are going to be checking every configuration setting and double checking and auditing it and whatnot. As far as banks not adopting XRP, banks are for-profit institutions like any other company. They're going to adopt the solution that is cheapest, that is fastest, and that solves their need. It's quite provable that the fees on the XRP network are lower, the speeds are higher, and it's not vulnerable to all these malicious activity like we just talked about for last hour. So unless you have exact hard data, this is just FUD, and I'm not going to accept this. To go on what you said, Joe, do you have any additional things? I want to loop back to proof of work, because proof of work is fundamentally unethical to me. Anyone that's supporting a proof of work model is literally taking resources away from scientists and mathematicians who need those same computational resources to do their work.
So are you talking about, someone pulled a GPU, they're buying up GPUs?
I encourage everyone to check out a project known as Gridcoin. Gridcoin is, they reward you for dedicating your GPU, your computer, to actually solving scientific problems. So there's problems like computing prime numbers, folding.
Yeah, Richard Hart was trying to do the same thing with CFD token.
Yeah, Gridcoin has succeeded in this metric. You dedicate your computer to it, to actual problems which humanity needs to be solved, not some arbitrary mathematical equation as Bitcoin does, and then you get rewarded via Gridcoin. And in the case of Gridcoin,
the energy argument though is so broad. I mean, you could say, well, you know what? In the month of December alone in the United States, Christmas lights account for more than the mining electricity used in the entire globe. So should people not be using Christmas lights in the month of December? You know, this debate is just it's not the same. Would I rather use my electricity to uphold the most sound currency in the planet, which is BTC, Bitcoin, to me? I believe absolutely. We're using electricity to fund the treasury. We're using electricity to fund our entire financial system. So the electricity debate is a completely different thing.
Bitcoin is the most sound currency on the planet.
I agree it's debatable, but what I'm saying is the electricity debate is just it's not worth exploring right now. We can go on for days.
Yeah, that's the core issue. I mean, the proof of work camp has not provided any.
So do you think people should light up their Christmas lights in December?
Take focus away from the proof of work.
But like, do you think people should light up their Christmas lights in December or no?
We're talking about cryptocurrencies. We're not talking.
Yeah, but you're talking about consumption of electricity, and we're saying, all right, which one is better? So Anthony wants to jump in. Sorry, me and you have been.
I'm not going down this road.
As far as scientists go, in general, for the hardware aspect, scientists aren't that interested in hashing SHA-256, and Intel and their wafer manufacturers pump out way more chips than anything that any proof of work network uses. There's
prices of these in 2017 pumping out, but if the demand exceeds the supply, then prices are going to arise, and science community do not have access to these resources.
So no, but scientists
often resources are used for these things, and it's literally denying these people from being able to do valuable work for your own proof of work model, which is inefficient and can be solved in other means. It's case closed.
So okay, it's not the same thing. Even though there is a lot of mining hardware out there relative to the total size of hardware available in the world, it is a lot larger. It's additive. You know, it's not that people, chip manufacturers are not stopping making GPUs and other ASIC type devices just because they can sell proof of work miners. They are making these in addition to them. In a lot of cases, these ASIC manufacturers they're not putting anywhere near as much money into these fabricators as, say, an AMD or NVIDIA. So scientists are not running out of hardware. Scientists have ample hardware. In a lot of cases, there are a lot of
the manufacturers can only produce a certain amount. If the demand in that time exceeds the supply, the prices are going to go up, and the academic and research institutions have to pay more for their research, which means higher prices across the board. So you are literally, by wasting resources on proof of work models, you are literally just increasing the prices of many other assets across the spectrum.
You're really not, because this hardware, makes up a very small amount of the total fabrication. In that same way, I shouldn't have a cell phone, because that could also be dedicated towards chips for scientists. Scientists will always take more available processing power, especially for AI, but they're not in want of it. And then on the energy aspect of it, Bitcoin miners and any ASIC miner in general has this great property that it can actually be used on energy that is essentially free, or that would otherwise be waste energy. So you're seeing, and obviously the numbers haven't been fully collected. I actually saw a study this morning, and they were saying they were going to go to the second level and actually figure out the sources that these large mining groups are using for energy. But in quite a lot of cases, it seems that the most, or at least in basic economic terms, the best energy to use for mining Bitcoin is either super cheap or free. And so you end up with a lot of electricity that gets produced from renewables, but it's trapped because there's no way to route it out across the country. It's just going to essentially be wasted, be burned off as steam or released as heat instead. And
hey,
so
if you have free energy,
definitely, and I believe
I'm sure a lot of people here would love to access free energy. I know a lot of people in the energy industry, and
well, they can move to a very remote location where they're doing geothermal.
okay,
right
desert.
a dam, and they can get their free electricity, but it's not very convenient. It's not very nice. You can have free electricity, but not have anything else around you for hundreds or thousands of miles.
Or you can use a Byzantine
Bitcoin miners don't care.
Distributed network with a fraction of the cost.
It's not the same. It's just not. And proof of work is a really beautiful idea that even cuts down on spam in our emails, and makes a lot of antisocial or bad, poorly motivated activities prohibitively expensive. And it's great that it's been applied to currency.
I personally agree. I know that this is not going to be a conversation where we all agree on everything. So, I mean, I definitely want to say I think it's healthy for us to disagree. I think it's okay. And I think this is definitely primed for a part two. I feel like we hit about half that list. I mean, I think we answered some questions, but I think the bigger thing is people are going to hear what they wanted to hear. We don't have anything conclusive, and I'd like to smash some of these things a little harder. So what do you guys say that we, come back? This was round one. This is a proper introduction. We were able to be 99% civil, and is there
friends? I mean, there's no
yeah.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, is there anything on a closing note? Let's all do a closing note. Take a couple minutes to speak your last thoughts. 5 minutes, a piece. Let's start with you, Mo.
Yeah, sure. We threw at the beginning, Joe, you said you didn't want to get into a lot of technical details, but we kind of did. It's really hard to avoid these in these debates and discussions. But, for the audience, if you're not able to follow along, or if there's something that's beyond you, don't worry about it. Try to, dig below the surface, right? Try to do your own research, as the famous quote goes in the crypto world. Look into the history of these networks, the different different attacks that organizations that were performed against these networks, and draw your own conclusions. DevNull Productions, it's quite obvious that XRP is going to be the standard going forward. It's being adopted by banks. It hasn't been, there have been 0 forks on XRP, unlike many of the other proof of work models, proof of stake models. It's energy efficient, and thus we are, putting our, we're walking the walk. We're not just talking the talk. I've personally invested the last 2 years into developing an analytics system based on the technology, and we are so confident that it is the future that we're jumping and going along.
Yeah, so Mo Morsi saying XRP the standard. It's it's the bee's knees. And Anthony, your takeaway.
Yeah. Okay. So to echo what Mo said, absolutely make sure you do your own research and that you understand all these different networks. There's a lot of design considerations in all of them that are very interesting, and I know most people aren't going to dive deep into the technicals. Also, though, don't think that any one of us is any one side or one way. I'm obviously supportive of Bitcoin for the overwhelming majority of cases and things. But if you were to look into my history, you could even see that my username Pyskill, which is on Twitter and also on the XRP forums, it's on both those places and several other places. You might even see me in one of the Ripple discords. But in general, I would say that the language we have around these networks isn't adequate for describing the types of things we're trying to describe, which is why we argue centralization and decentralization. I would say for the purposes of this, all networks relative to each other, cryptocurrency networks, and exclusive of other types of centralization or decentralization, I would say that Bitcoin has a design that trends towards decentralization, whereas Ripple has a design that trends towards centralization. And viewing one as exclusively good or bad is kind of a difficult thing. It's more important to understand when you're using these things what it is you're actually getting into and what it is that they actually give you. And in the case of Bitcoin, Bitcoin gives you a free sovereign money that nobody has any control over in order to disenfranchise you. And if they try and exert control over it, they have two ways. They can either spend a ton of money to exert control over it via proof of work, and in which case any control they exert is temporary and largely doesn't affect the majority of participants. And the other way is in software forks, which are different from network forks. And those are two completely different things. So going back to my point about language, forks are not equivalent when you're talking about a software fork or something versus a network fork or something. But again, that's one of many, many topics. If you're going to get involved in cryptocurrency, spend the first 2 years reading about it and learning about it, because anything less is just not enough.
Agreed. Do your own research. It's going to take a long time. It's a steep learning curve. Mo, I know that you probably wanted to add another 2 minutes minimum. Did you want? I know Anthony just said a lot. Did you want to jump in and just do your last closeout to say anything more, or are we good?
I think we're wrapping up here. The only thing I want to add is devnull.network. That's our website. Check us out if you're interested in kind of on-ledger, deep on-ledger analytics and statistics. We'd be more than willing to work with you. We love talking cryptocurrencies. And like Anthony said, to quote Brad Garlinghouse, the CEO of Ripple Labs, I'm bullish on Bitcoin. I personally am bullish because I think it has a historical value. It's like people collect ancient Roman coins, for example. Are those coins used in circulation? No, but they are a part of history, and we acknowledge that, and that has value because of that. And that's what I see the major value of Bitcoin and kind of some of these, maybe Ethereum and some of these proof of work networks being in the future. As far as utility and using them for actual day-to-day purposes and solutions, XRP is the go-to solution. So, you want to find out what's going on in the ledger at any given day, any given hour, whatnot, go to our website and check us out, devnull.network.
Yeah, and ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed the show. We'll have a thread, ask questions on Twitter, set us up for part 2. I do believe that we can open the door to that. And it was great speaking with both of you. Thank you so much for coming on. And I look forward to communicating another bit of information in the future.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot.
Nice meeting you, Mo.
You too.
Take care, everyone.